Welcome to Knock Doc. I'm your host, William Hall, broadcasting live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Debunking Missionary Claims with Rabbi Moshe Shulman. Tonight we'll be discussing outside the New Testament, where is the support of Jesus? Rabbi Moshe Shulman, thank you for showing up tonight. Dear Rabbi, appreciate you.
Yeah, I haven't been.
I know you've had a busy past, recent past, and glad to have you back in the studio. So, for sure.
Good. Okay. Since it was 2 weeks ago, I just want to do a quick run over what we did before.
Super.
And get into why the main topic of today, of course, is we're going to start discussing Jesus outside of the New Testament. The claim is made by Christians a lot of times that Jesus' life is the most documented historical figure in history, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So we're going to actually look at all the documents, all the data we have for the first 100 years or so from Christian sources, which might be at least close to the time of Jesus' time, and see what they tell us. Again, all this information I'm actually bringing from Christian evangelical works. It's not disputed. So,
right.
Okay. Before we start that, I just want to do a quick review. Remember, we talked last time about a couple of subjects, and I just want to bring it back into our minds before we do this, because we have to think. We're now dealing here with this history. Dealing with history is a little bit different than dealing with religious belief. If you believe by your theology and faith that the New Testament is true fact and inerrant, I mean, that's a different issue. We discussed a little bit about the canon, and we're going to go through some of the things which, when we're dealing with historicity issues, we're going to deal with certain historical events that are claimed to have occurred in the New Testament. We're going to examine them as to whether they actually correspond to known history, which is a different issue. But essentially, the New Testament has to stand by historical standards. We discussed before about Michaelson and his work on the resurrection, which is going to be another discussion that we're going to come up with in the resurrection and the supposed proofs of it. But Lucona points out a number of things, and one of them is, of course, is dealing with the issue of what the gospel accounts were, that they were really what they call Roman or Greek biographies, which are not meant to be literal historical events, but sometimes things are taught close to the truth, or the idea of what was said. Also with that, Lucona made a point that when one examines documentation, there's certain methodologies, certain methodological approaches. Now, one that's very common is to do with straight skepticism of the New Testament, without any basis, just skepticism. Then there is credulity, which is to assume it's true, and then it's neutrality, to say, let's see each side doing its own. My approach is basically what I do is I do logical analysis based on various things. The New Testament is a type of a text. The Gospels specifically were written in order to prove to people who never actually met Jesus that Jesus was a certain person. He was a Messiah, and even more than just a human being. How much more we'll discuss when we get into theology. But it's written as propaganda for a new religion. It's not written, like, for example, the letters from Paul were written that Paul was writing what his understanding of the theology of Jesus, what his gospel was. He refers to it all the time as his gospel. So you have to understand that when you're looking at, so these documents are by nature, they're not just biographies, but they're actually biographies written for propaganda purposes. You have to keep that in mind. Thucydides has an agenda with his history. Josephus does also. If you're aware of Josephus' agenda, then there's certain things that you will know to take with a grain of salt, or to not to look at it a little bit. One example that I think I brought last time was that Josephus pumps up his CV as far as being a Pharisee, knowledgeable Pharisee, but there's enough information, enough stuff in his autobiography and other things to indicate that he was not the biggest Pharisee that was around, not so knowledgeable, but a Pharisee nonetheless. So if you take that into consideration, many things are there you can judge. Well, the same thing applies to the New Testament. And I'm talking specifically about the Gospels because that's where we know about the history of Jesus, whether he lived or not, whatever. When you look at it, you have to judge it on that way. And rather than being totally skeptical, or rather than credulity, will be analyzing when I discuss historicals, exactly what actually says there. Does it pass certain tests? Does it seem to be logically consistent? But always in the back of my mind, remember, this is for propaganda. Another point that I reiterated, which I did discuss earlier, is the principle that we discussed about of failing prophecy, when a prophecy fails, which applies directly to the Gospels because, after all, a principle which is almost universally accepted was that the Jewish people had accepted a Messiah who was supposed to be a victorious, not a Messiah who was supposed to fail. So we don't see any indications of any literature from that time that the Messiah was supposed to fail. He was supposed to come, and in that time that he came, he was supposed to be successful. And we see hints of that, of course, in the New Testament also, in Gospels, where we see a few times it says, this generation shall not pass until everything comes to pass. Okay, we see indications, even in Paul letters, we see indications that they understood, that the time was then. So they understood that the Messiah had to come a certain time, and he wasn't supposed to leave this world before that. So we have this principle of failed prophecy, where we see that given certain conditions, the failure of the prophecy doesn't stop a movement, but in fact lets it continue. I mentioned a few books about the subject. Jehovah's Witness is a good example, where they actually had predictions of Jesus' return in 1876 and a few other dates. And even though they failed miserably to be fulfilled, they found ways of reorganizing, redefining what their decision was, what was supposed to have happened, and continuing until today. I gave you other examples of Shabtai Tzvi, for example, who was a Jewish person who considered himself Messiah. He was forced to convert to Islam, and even in his lifetime, when he was still alive, they came out with ways of understanding why it was actually necessary for the Messiah to convert to Islam. And actually, his followers lasted for quite a number of years. I say there's still some of them left in Turkey. And then the third one that I mentioned was with Lubavitch, which I know, having lived through the events, when Lubavitch was alive, his followers did believe that he was the one of his generation who could be Mashiach. And basing it on Jewish principles that we believe, since the Messiah can come at any time, there obviously has to be somebody in that generation alive who could actually be the Messiah. So there's a belief that somebody here could be the Messiah if he was worthy of it. And I pointed out that they indicated from before while Lubavitch was alive that Mashiach would come and he would never die. As soon as he died, within a very short amount of time, and we're talking not years or decades, but we're in fact talking about days and weeks. The idea that Lubavitch was still Messiah, even though he died, he was coming back. Various ways as to explain what it is. The tomb where he's buried in Queens is actually empty. There's nothing there. All kinds of things which sound somewhat familiar to what we've heard in the Gospels: empty tombs, somebody dying unexpectedly and not really being dead, being alive, and that kind of thing. So when we analyze the historicity issues of the New Testament, we have to take in consideration the idea of failed prophecy and what happens, which clearly would apply to the New Testament. And we have to look at many other different issues. And now, again, before I'm going to go into it, it's very important to see, is there any outside sources that give us any information about Jesus? Now, as I said in the beginning, there are certain things that I accept as fact. The rabbis clearly accepted this also. Um, there was a person named Jesus. He actually lived and died. He was killed by the Romans. That's pretty much agreed to. And that in all probability, he and his followers thought he was somebody who at least could have been Messiah in his time. Those are the things. Now, Josephus brings other people who at the time were also considered that way. Jesus wasn't the only one. But Jesus was the only one who actually had followers afterwards. Now, I mentioned about failed prophecy. There are a few conditions that are there. But one of the interesting conditions which seem to be very prevalent in many of these cases is that the person who was the Messiah was actually some kind of a teacher also. Certainly that was the case in Chapter 3, certainly this case of the Baba Shereba. Jehovah's Witnesses, there was teachings, there was groups, they had a group identity that was able to continue with teachings, people were teaching. So there are certain sociological things which would lead to it. The New Testament and the Gospels is clearly talking about that Jesus did have people around him, he would go around. So it does indicate that there's a distinct possibility that actually Jesus did have the formation of a kind of a group from which a failed prophecy could lead to a continuation with a certain modifications. Okay, so if we get back to it, we're going to go deal with history. We're going to deal with a few things. We're going to start going on to external history, what we have, how much it verifies, and then we're going to eventually go into looking at certain events in the New Testament to see if they're historically valid, to tell us whether we should really consider how much we should consider the Gospels as reflective of fact, and then after that we're going to deal with some other issues like who the real Jesus was in the New Testament, what he was like, and things of that nature. So that's basically what we're going to deal with history. A little bit different when you see the books, but basically some of the main topics that we see. So let's deal with the issue of history. Now, excluding Jesus, who wrote, excluding Josephus, who wrote at the end of the 1st century, we have no documentation of anybody writing in the 1st century about Jesus. We have no documents for that, no information at all. Now, in a sense, there is an argument that really doesn't make much of a difference, since many important people from that time, we don't have really very much external information about him also, so it doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't occur. Not anything, something not appearing about him doesn't really mean doesn't occur. However, we want to analyze when we do hear from him to see how much people knew about him. Certainly by the end of the 1st century into the 2nd century, Christians were known, and we're going to find about this from the sources. So Christians were known. The question is, how much do they know about Christians, and does this give any first-hand information about Jesus himself, or is it basically just like I tell you, we believe there was a guy who was killed by Pilate and something like that, but basically we have no clue what he was about, what he might really have been about. So the first one I want to deal with, in the early 2nd century, there were 2 Roman historians, Suetonius and Tacitus. Both of them have references in them which are understood to refer to Jesus. So I want to deal with them one at a time. Let's look at Suetonius. Suetonius brings actually 2 instances where people who are thought to be possibly Jesus occurred. One of them occurs in the time of the Emperor Claudius, which comes out to be about 49 CE in the Common Era. And the second one refers to the time of Nero, Kaiser Nero, in 64, just shortly before the actual outbreak of the Jewish War. Now, the first instance in Suetonius, talking Claudius, is a very, very short passage. It doesn't say very much. And let me just first read it to you. He, referring to Claudius, expelled the Jews from Rome since they were always making disturbances because of the instigator Chrestus. Now, the instigator Chrestus does create certain problems. First of all, Crestus seems similar to Christ, as the source here I'm looking at talks about. It's similar to Christ, but that's not it. It doesn't say Christ. It says Crestus. Crestus was a Greek name, so it's Crestus should be a Roman name. So it doesn't necessarily, mean that. Now there is a variant that has it, but it doesn't mean it. And even more would be of a difficult problem here, is it seems to be indicating that Jesus was actually in Rome in 49 CE, which would seem to be a little bit of a problem. So there's a lot of reasons to be uncertain as to whether this does refer to Jesus or not. Now, if we assume it is, and it's just the information got garbled in the retelling, which again, we have to realize that this for many, many years, they were totally insignificant. So that one could have heard of them and not had very much information. So Suetonius saying that doesn't really tell us very much. I think there's one thing that we could say out of this that we can possibly, again, it's a little bit of a speculation. Some people might not want to go that far, but this passage of Suetonius seems to indicate that, at least at that time, Jesus was known to be Jewish, and that there was some controversy about that in Rome. Controversy to the point that Claudius just sent out all the Jewish people from Rome itself. Now they came back not long afterwards, obviously, but so here we see an indication of a possible indication that early Christians who were Jewish were still part of the Christian community, which is something I accept as being, in fact, it was certainly a Jewish Christian group. We're going to discuss later. One of the things I want to bring up is when Christianity actually split from Judaism, or when there was actually a possibility of saying that there was a distinction between Christianity and Judaism. This instance here obviously seems to indicate that this is not the time. So anyways, in one of the works I'm using is from Robert E. Van Voorst. I think I've mentioned him before. He is a professor of New Testament at Western Theological Seminary in Michigan. I believe it's also an evangelical institution. So, and he brings this. It's a very nice book on the history of Jesus outside of the New Testament. Now, the second passage that deals with him occurs in the time of Nero, when Nero was on the throne. Now, those of you who know history know that in 64 CE there was a big fire in Rome, and the emperor at the time, Nero, did not do a very good job. He was not very competent. He didn't do a very good job, and so the fire took over most of the city, burnt a lot of the area, and this caused obviously a lot of people to be angry. So Nero needed to have a scapegoat. So he chose out to scapegoat the Christians. So we see again is Suetonius in his Life of Nero. The previous quote by the way was called The Life of Claudius. Suetonius wrote a book on the emperors. I think it's called The 12 Emperors. I could look it up and make sure, but it's called The 12 Emperors. And so he wrote on different emperors. Suetonius wrote on the previous one was about Claudius. This was about Nero. So about he says here, punishment was inflicted on the Christians, a body of people addicted to a novel and mischievous superstition. Now, I think we get from this a few pieces of information, which for us is very important. It doesn't tell us anything about Jesus, by the way, but it does tell us that by 64 there was a group called Christians. Now, interesting, because he calls it a novel superstition, obviously it appears that these Christians were not Jewish. They could have been Gentile Christians at the time that were being blamed for it, but they were obviously not Jewish. Why? Because Judaism was a well-known religion. It wasn't novel, it wasn't new. It was called a superstition. Judaism was always referred to as superstition. Basically, any non-Roman religion would be called a superstition. Superstition didn't have the same type of nuance and connotation at that time as it does now. But anyways, it was called a superstition then. So we see, first of all, that they're Christians. So they're a distinct group. And number two is that they seem to have already separated from the Jewish people. They weren't called the Jewish sect, whereas during the time of Claudius, it was the Jews who were sent out because of Christus, meaning the followers of this Christus were Jewish people also. And if we do accept the view, although there are scholars who say it wasn't Christ, it wasn't Jesus, but let's assume that that's the case. I want to try and give the best support that's possible. If that's the case, and we realize at that time the Christians who were in Rome in 49 were actually Jewish, whereas by 64 the Christians seem to have been non-Jewish in Rome. Keep that in the back of your mind. Now, that's what we have Suetonius. Not very much. We don't know anything about life. We don't know what he taught. He did seem to have to teach a religion of some sort because it's referred to as superstition. So we seem to understand that Jesus did come up with some things that the Romans would consider superstition, being something that they would not accept, seem to be contrary to the religion. We'll find out about more when we read the letters of Pliny. But so we see that that's existing in a non-Jewish context. Again, it's not talking about Jewish Christianity, it's about non-Jewish Christianity. Jewish Christianity is a little bit different story. I'll get into that and some of the information we have about that later. Now, next one is Tacitus. Tacitus also wrote about the same time as Suetonius. He also wrote a history of Rome. And he writes about in the time of Nero. Now, he writes a little bit more. So he gives us a little bit more information than Suetonius does. And he's writing also about the same situation in Rome at the time of Nero. He refers to the Christians as being a class of men loathed for their vices. Very common complaint about the Christians, that they were considered to be immoral. It's not relevant to here as far as that. But if we gave a class on Christian history, one of the main things is they considered Christians to be immoral. So he goes here, and this is where the important information comes back. They got their name from Christ, who was executed by the sentence of procurator Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. That checked the pernicious superstition for a short time, but it broke out afresh, not only in Judea, where the plague first arose, but in Rome itself, where all the horrible and shameful things in the world collect and find a home. Now, from this we get a few things. First of all, this information seems to be much more in line with information that we know. Again, the question is, where did he get it from? This is probably just from rumors of what's going around at the time, but his information by that time is much better, meaning that one thing we can say from there, since his information seems to be, getting better, that at least he has more contact with Christians, or he's got better sources. But he does. He comes up with a number of points here, which I think correspond to things that we can certainly accept. Number one, they get their name from Christ, so they understand that Christ was a title. Well, here it seems a name, but certainly the name of Christ, as it's been used in for example, Paul refers to Jesus as Christ Jesus, as if Christ was his name. Second thing is that they get the time when he was executed was at the time of Tiberius and Pontius Pilate. Whether most likely they got it from Christians, because at that time there were Christians around, as we'll see from Pliny the Younger, but there certainly was a case. And apparently they feel that the superstition that he started, his followers died out, but again, afterwards they reinstituted themselves, which certainly the book of Acts talks about that. And then it started spreading, as the Acts and Paul's letters seem to indicate they went to different places, so they came to Rome. So we do see some support of, at least that there was somebody named Christ. He had some kinds of teachings, although they know nothing about what he taught, at least in this source. And even more importantly, Judaism is not mentioned here, meaning that the Christians that he was aware of that Nero was persecuted, just as the case of Suetonius, were not Jewish. And the connection between Judaism and Christianity doesn't appear there. Even though it said that it came from Judea, but remember Judea had non-Jews also. So the connection between a sect of being a sect of Judaism or being a different thing does not appear to be there. So that's what we get from the historians. Now, those are only historians that give us information from that time. The information we have is very small, but it does indicate that at least by the 2nd century, Christians were beginning to become something that at least were noticed, even though they were, considered superstition and considered like sort of weird way out there, but still it was noticed. Now, the next thing I want to deal with are the letters from Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger was governor in Bithynia. Bithynia is somewhere in Turkey. I'm not sure quite. I think the southern coast of Turkey. He was a governor there, and he was a governor under Trajan. What makes his works, his uncle was Pliny the Elder. I think he died in Pompeii, if I remember correctly. Now, what makes Pliny the Younger very interesting is he was a governor, and he seemed to be very conscientious or just very, strange, in that he wrote a lot of letters to Emperor Trajan, asking him what to do about in various situations, always asking the emperor for advice. And so we find that in one of his letters, he found about the Christians, and they were persecuting the Christians. I don't understand why would they persecute Christians. I'm not sure if I remember to mention this before, but I'll mention it now again. Roman religion was very, very liberal, in the sense that they wouldn't bother you in whatever you worshiped, as long as you would also worship, as part of your worship, as part of your acknowledgement of your gods, to acknowledge the gods of the Romans. And if you didn't, they would have a problem with that. Judaism, they didn't have a problem because it's older. So what was the problem? I've described this a few times before. I don't remember if I described it here, but it's worth saying over again. The pagan polytheistic idea of God is much different than what we have. We believe that there's a God who created the world, who requires of us things. He actually acts in this world in a benevolent manner, as a judge in this world in various different ways in this world. And most importantly is Judaism, and Christianity picked up from Judaism, is exclusivity. There's only one. All the other gods are like nothing. You may worship your God, whatever it is, but it's just stone, it's just nothing, it's not going to do anything. God, Hashem, the God of Israel, he's the real God in the world, and the other ones are just nothing. Now, for the polytheists, the pagans in Roman times, they had a problem because they believed in many different gods, and they expected you to show respect. In fact, if you didn't believe in the gods, they considered you an atheist, which is a very serious problem, because being an atheist was like basically a capital offense. They would kill you for that. So what happens is the Romans, when they came to their religious practices, they would give sacrifice. What do they give sacrifices? They didn't give sacrifices for the way we understand from Leviticus and stuff like that. They gave sacrifices basically like you pay extortion money to the mafia. You pay the mafia money, and your store's windows don't get broken, and nobody's going to rob you. The pagans believed if you gave sacrifices, you followed the proper customs of sacrifices and worship for their gods, then you would be protected from everything, bad things happening. That's why we had gods of the hearth, gods of the this, gods of the that. Each one had a separate thing, and basically you had to give them, pay them off in order that things should be good for the state. And we find many times in Roman history when things weren't going good for the state, those actually were times when Christians were actually persecuted because they would not worship the state idols. Now, the Jews, of course, got out of it, because since the religion was old, the Romans believed that their gods must have had some kind of agreement with them, that it's okay for their followers not to give them because they're around old, even though it's a strange superstition and it's false and whatever like that, and the Jews are almost atheists. Still, since the Roman gods seem to have allowed these people to be around and they're happy with it, they're not going to bother them. But the Christians, of course, had a problem because unless they were Jewish and they claimed to be practicing Judaism, they were practicing an illegal religion. They were not part of the Roman religion because they would not worship the Roman gods. So whenever they would find out somebody who would not be worshiping the Roman gods, meaning who wasn't paying his portion of the protection money they had to give for the idols, for their gods, that would be a serious problem. And they would force they would tell them you either have to sacrifice or you're going to die because you're causing danger to the community, because we have to pay off these gods. If we don't pay off the gods, things bad are going to happen to us. So that's the basic background to understand Pliny. Now what happens is Pliny writes to Trajan and he's asking him what he's supposed to do because he's found these Christians. And it's interesting to read what it says here. Now, I'm going to read this. It's a little bit of a long letter, but it's just interesting. Interesting in the sense that it gives you an insight to what's going on. There's a lot of things to talk about in that period of time. Persecutions by you get the impression that the Christians were searched out. Let's find those Christians and do what it is. Well, there were a few of those. Diocletian, can't remember the other names of them. There were a number of them where it was actually the case. Yes, Christians were looked at, but in general, it wasn't the same thing. It's not like during the Holocaust where if a Christian was hiding there, they'd look for you. They didn't look for that. In fact, one of the things that we find is actually Christians, because they wanted to emulate Jesus, many Christians actually wanted to be martyred, and they did things in order to get martyred. So let's read this letter that comes out here. My Lord, he's writing to Trajan, Emperor Trajan. It is my custom to consult you whenever I am in doubt about any matter. Who is better able to direct my hesitation or instruct my ignorance? This is like, it's very interesting. I have never been present at Christian trials. Okay. He doesn't know what to do with Christians, so he's asking, what do I do? Consequently, I do not know the precedents regarding the question of punishment or the nature of the Inquisition. Now again, their major concern is, of course, the Christians will not sacrifice to the gods because of the so it's very serious. I have been in no little doubt whether some discrimination is made with regard to age, or whether the young are treated no differently from the older. Should you consider young not knowledgeable, whatever? Interesting question. Whether renunciation wins indulgence, or it is of no avail to have abandoned Christianity if one has once been a Christian. Whether the very profession of the name is to be punished, or only the disgraceful practices which go along with the name. So if you call yourself a Christian, but you don't pray on Sunday, you don't eat the Eucharist, then maybe not. So far, this has been my procedure, and now he's going to outline what exactly he's doing, because he wants the emperor to tell him, is this how you're supposed to deal with it? Now, this, by the way, it was written in the first decade of the 2nd century. So we see, of course, Christians are known, and the problems about them have been known also at that time. So far, this has been my procedure when people were charged before me with being Christians. I have asked the accused themselves if they were Christians. If they said yes, I asked them a second and a third time, warning them of the penalty. If they persisted, I ordered them to be led off to the execution. Capital offense, because, of course, as a Christian, they refused to pay their protection money to the Roman gods. For I have no doubt that whatever kind of thing it was that they pleaded guilty to, their stubbornness and unyielding obstinacy at any rate deserved to be punished. There were others afflicted with like matters, whom I marked down to refer to Rome, because they were Roman citizens. So this is very interesting. We do see that, in fact, if you're a Roman citizen, you had to be sent to Rome to be judged, whereas others were not. Later, as usually happens, the trouble spread by the very fact that it has been dealt with, and further varieties came to my notice. An anonymous document was laid before me containing many people's names. Some of these denied that they were Christians or had ever been so. At my dictation, they invoked the gods and did reverence with incense and wine to your image. Now, this is important to understand. What is the way to know if this person is a good Roman citizen? If they worship the idols, if they worship the gods. Now, it's important to remember that the Jews never had to do that. No Jews were ever forced, except under certain periods of persecution, but basically that never was really an issue, because worshiping the Jewish God was okay because their mafia, the Roman mafia, their gods, said it was okay. Here, that was not the situation. So we see clearly that Christians we are dealing with here never consider themselves Jewish, because otherwise they could have just said, well, we're just a Jewish sect. We're Jews for Jesus. Sound familiar? Okay. So we see early on, Christians did not consider them Jews, except for the small Jewish group, which we'll talk about sometime. Which I ordered to be brought for me to listen. As I informed the people who are real, what happened here? At my dictation, they invoked the God of it, which I ordered to be brought before them as such a God. They also cursed Christ. And as I am informed that people who are really Christians cannot possibly be made to do any of these things, I consider the people who did them should be discharged. So he's telling you how to know who's a Christian. Others against whom I received information said that they were Christians, and denied it. They said, that they had once been Christians, but had given it up, some 3 years previously, some a longer time, 1 or 2 as many as 20 years before. All these likewise did reverence to your image and the statue of the gods and cursed Christ. Okay, so how do you know if you're Christians or not? If you're going to worship the idol. Okay. But they maintained that their fault or error amounted to nothing more than this. Okay, and here's interesting. This is very important because it now tells us a little bit about Christianity at the time of the beginning of the 2nd century, maybe the end of the 1st century. They were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before sunrise and reciting an antiphonal hymn to Christ as God. Okay, so the first thing is, we see already by the end of the 1st century, they have worshipped Christ, to Jesus, as if he was a God. Whether they believed he was a God, or whether he believed he was a being who was greater than human, but not quite a God, and they worshipped him. All these are types of Christology that existed. I'm not clear about that, but one is clearly to be understood that Christ was not considered just a simple human being. And binding themselves with an oath, and this is what it is, not to commit any crime, and to abstain from acts of theft, robbery, and adultery. Okay, sounds a little about some of the 7 mitzvahs of B'nai Noach, and also very similar to Acts 15. From breaches of faith, from repudiating a trust when called upon to honor, keeping the word, not lying. After this, they went on. It was a custom to separate and then meet again to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. So they had some kind of a meal together. They would eat together. Some people believe this was the Eucharist, where they would eat together. Some say it's just a feast that they eat together as a community. And even this, they said, they had given up doing since the publication of my edict, in which, according to your instructions, I had placed a ban on private associations. Now, what he's talking about private associations like this. Emperors were very much concerned about conspiracies against them. So Trajan came out with a decree, which is mentioned here. I'm reading from by F.F. Bruce's book, by the way. There was a decree that it came out, making the prohibitions. For example, and I'm going to read from the decree from the emperor. Fire brigades should not be organized. The proper course is for each proprietor and household to have a firefighting equipment constantly available so that fires can be tackled before they spread too far. The trouble with fire brigades is simply this. Any organization which brings men together, whatever its original ostensible purpose may be, sooner or later develops into a secret society with subversive political aims. So Trajan came out with a law prohibiting organizations. Okay? Now, what happened is the Christians organized and came together. And they claimed it was religious in organization. Now, you can't forbid all religions coming together, then you wouldn't be able to worship your idols or your gods. So basically what happens is, well, if it's part of the Roman pantheon, even if it's a new god, but it's part of the Roman pantheon, you believe that you worship them, then you're a legal religion, and it's fine, your organization coming together. But if not, then it's a problem. So that's really what's going on here. So anyways, so he says, and even this, they said they had given up doing since the publication of my edict, in which, according to your instructions, I had placed a ban on private associations. Meaning this coming together and having this meal together, this Eucharist meal, was actually forbidden now by law because the emperors were worried about subversive societies. So I thought it more necessary to inquire into the real truth of the matter by subjecting to torture 2 female slaves who were called deacons. But I found nothing more than a perverse superstition which went beyond all bounds. So we heard from these people under persecution, torture, exactly what was with Christianity, what was going on. He thought it was really bizarre and outside of the normal. And of course, the word deacons were being used. Therefore, I deferred further inquiry in order to apply it to you for ruling. The case seemed to me to be a proper one for consultation, particularly because of the number of those who were accused. He had found quite a number of them already because they were already organized. For many of every age, every class, of both sexes are being accused and will continue to be accused. Nor has the contagious superstition spread through the cities only, but also through the villages and the countryside. So we see that Christianity is spreading into that area. Well, we know that Paul went out to there, so we know there's some spreading going on. But I think it can be checked and put right. At any rate, the temples, which have been well nigh abandoned, are beginning to be frequented again. So what happened? How they notice it? These people became Christians, stopped going to the temples. Because again, if you're a Christian, you cannot go to the temple and worship the Roman gods. And you can't do it. So what happens? You stop going there, and that's how they draw attention to themselves. Otherwise, they wouldn't have known them. And the customary services, which had been neglected for a long time, are beginning to be resumed. Fodder for the sacrificial animals, too, is beginning to find a sale again, where hitherto it was difficult to find anyone to buy them. So Christianity took over there, and of course it wouldn't do it. From all of this, it is easy to judge what a multitude of people can be reclaimed if an opportunity is granted them to renounce Christianity. Okay, so he wrote to them saying, listen, this is a situation. We got this group of guys, these Christians, and, they're not worshiping our idols at all. And, so our temples are empty. Our gods aren't being paid off their protection money. What are we supposed to do about this? Now, these people come under the rule that you had that you shouldn't have organizations. So what are we going to do about it? So here is the answer that comes back. My dear Secundus was apparently Pliny's name that he knew him by. You have acted with perfect correctness in deciding the cases of those who have been charged before you with being Christians. Okay, so he's told them, hey, did a good job. Indeed, no general decision can be made by which a set form of dealing with them could be established. They must not be fairly allowed. If they are charged and convicted, they must be punished, provided that anyone who denies that he is a Christian and gives practical proof of that by invoking our gods is to be pardoned on the strength of this repudiation. So what's the situation? Okay. Basically, we can describe this as don't ask, don't tell. You don't ask somebody who's a Christian, but if they come to your attention, then if he's been accused of being Christian, but he will worship he will go back and worship the Roman gods, then that's fine. You let him go because you know he's not a Christian. No matter what grounds for the suspicion of because we've been passed. Anonymous documents, however, this is interesting. Anonymous documents which are laid before you should receive no attention in any case. They form a very bad precedent and are quite unworthy of the age in which we live. I find this very funny. Every generation seems to think that they're very moral, upright, and very civilized. So Trajan's saying, listen, we're too civilized to deal with, anonymous things, which is very interesting. Remember that Stalinist Russia, anonymous complaints, or even today, an anonymous whistleblower has started an impeachment of the President of the United States. Whereas in the time of Trajan, anonymous people don't mean anything. If you're anonymous, I don't want to hear from you. It's a very bad precedent to take anonymous things. People have to be known. So anyways, what we see here first is very interesting. We see that there are Christians. Pliny knows of them. Trajan's aware of them also. So they have started to become known in the empire. Numbers at this time are considered also very small, but enough that they are recognized. And in certain areas, in fact, even that the temples there get emptied because Christians would not worship to them. And of course, the problem was that we see here is essentially that they're organizations, and there's concern that they don't worship the proper gods that they're supposed to worship. Not worshiping the gods would consider to be, you'd be considered to be a atheist. So that's what we see. These are the most important ones. Give us clear, decisive information. Again, we know nothing about Jesus. We know about Christians now. We have information about Christians at the end of the first century. We have information that Christians were considered a superstition, that they would not worship the Roman idols, the Roman gods, which was considered a very serious problem for the Romans, because basically the gods was the mafia. And we see that Trajan gives instructions. Instructions were not to ferret out the Romans, or the Christians, as much of the propaganda, well, I wouldn't say propaganda, but much of what people are told to believe is that in the beginning the Romans were very much into finding all the Christians and searching them all out. In fact, that's not the case. The exact opposite is the case. Trajan says, no, don't search them out, and don't accept anonymous people saying things, anonymous snitches. Don't accept it. If somebody's going to say something, you have to know who it is. So to know who this person actually is, and it's considered. And of course, if they come in and they renounce Christianity, then they go free. If they repent, if they do tshuva, and they go back to the Greek gods, then it's okay. Okay, now let's see what's going. These are the real ones that I consider you have to really take seriously. These were people who are dealing with history. Pliny even more, dealing with actual current events, actually what he's dealing with. So you find out basically that there's Christians. Now, there are other sources that are mentioned about Christians. In the second century, there was a fellow called Lucian of Samosata. Okay, now he was a satirist. Satirist meaning somebody who wrote like plays of some sort. Okay, so there are two instances where Jesus is mentioned. Remember, this is already in the middle of the second century, so people do now have an idea about Christianity. Christianity had a founder, and certain things Christians were teaching about him. We of course know that we're dealing now in a period of time where the New Testament was in formation. The books in the New Testament were basically there. Some were more popular in one place than other. There were gospels going around. So there was this information here, and so the information was available to tell people. It was there. So here's what he writes. Two things he writes in his works. This is one thing. During this period, Peregrinus associated himself with the priests and scribes of the Christians in Palestine and learned their astonishing wisdom. Of course, in a short time, he made them look like children. He was a prophet, leader, head of the synagogue, and everything all by himself. He explained and commented on some of their sacred writings and even wrote some himself. Then they looked up to him as a god and made him the lawgiver and chose him as the official patron of the group, or at least the vice patron. He was second only to that one whom they still worship today, the man in Palestine, who was crucified because he brought this new form of initiation into the world. So basically he's making fun of the Christians by saying that some guy goes down there and becomes a leader. He knows that they started off in Palestine, Israel, what's Israel today, and that he initiated some kind of new form of worship. Again, we know this basically from Pliny, Tacitus. We know it's pretty much that kind of stuff. This information was in fact known about the Christians at that time. Next, he continues in his story. It's called the death of Peregrinus. And so he continues. Having convinced themselves that they are immortal and will live forever, the poor wretches despise death and most willingly give themselves to it. That's very interesting because it does seem to be that there are sources indicating that Christians were willing to give up their life, even if not necessary. We see that Trajan did not search for them, but that actually Christians would make themselves known to the Romans in order that they should be taken and executed. Moreover, that first lawgiver of theirs persuaded them that they are all brothers the moment that they transgress and deny the Greek gods, and begin worship that crucified sophist living by his laws. Okay. So that's basically all they say. This is obviously not first-hand information. He says a little bit more. They scorn all their possessions without distinction and treat them as community property. It seems to be familiar from the Book of Acts. It seems to be a very common thing that we know the other time that they lived a communist type life. They accept such things as faith alone without any evidence. So they believe in something without having any proof of it. So if a fraudulent and cunning person who knows how to take advantage of this situation comes among them, he can make them rich in a short time while laughing. Make himself rich in a short time while laughing at these foolish people. Okay, he's basically making fun of the Christians. Doesn't give us very much information. But he does tell us some things. The next one is Celsus. Celsus, again, is somebody who looked into information, wrote a book about Christianity, against it, showing how foolish it was. And Origen wrote against him, contra Celsus. So that's where they came about. His book was well known. It was called The True Doctrine, and it's basically written against Christianity. Now, we don't have the book, but we do have passages in Celsus, in Origen's work, contra Celsus, which talk about it. So basically, what do we get from that? Celsus tells that Jesus came from a Jewish village. His mother was a poor country woman. He worked miracles by sorcery, all kinds of things. So we see that, again, at this time, what it says in the Gospels already written earlier was spreading out. We don't have first-hand information. We have information. We see that Christianity was on the growth at this time, and the information they had came from that. I see it's almost done. Let me just see if I can get some more of this done. The next one is Thallus. Thallus is very interesting because it's claimed to be very important. So, what do we know about Thallus? Thallus we know from a writing of Julius Africanus, who was in the 3rd century. And he writes that there was a person called Thallus. And this is what he says. In the 3rd book of his histories, Thallus calls this darkness an eclipse of the sun, which seems to me to be wrong. Apparently this Africanus had Thallus at the time. We don't have that book anymore. Thallus is talking about there was an eclipse, and would seem to be around a period of time when he believed Jesus to have lived. So he talks about an eclipse in that time. But Africanus says, no, that's not true. That wasn't that. That was a darkness that came. Darkness that came. By the way, Josephus knows nothing of that or anything like that. Now the problem is who is this Thallus? Some assume that Thallus is somebody mentioned of Josephus who was a Samaritan resident of Rome, who lived sometime in the 1st century. So there's a claim that might have been him, but we really have no proof of who this is. Thallus being not an uncommon name doesn't really tell us very much. Okay. As he says in the Van Voorst, what we know from this is basically almost nothing. We have no real information about it, and we know real proof of who it is. Okay. The next one we're going to look at is in both Bruce and here also, Serapion. Now, Mara ben Serapion, what is he right here? Here's what he writes. What else can we say when the wise are forcibly dragged off by tyrants, the wisdom is captured by insults, and the minds are oppressed and without defense? Okay, so he's decrying that in his time, people who were learned people were not considered very highly. What advantage did the Athenians gain by murdering Socrates, for which they were repaid with famine and pestilence? Well, the people of Samos by the burning of Pythagoras, because the country was covered in sand in just 1 hour, or the Jews by killing the wise king, because the kingdom was taken away from them at that very time. God had just repaid the wisdom of these 3 men. The Athenians died of famine, Samians were completely overwhelmed by the sea, and the Jews, desolate and driven from their own kingdom, are scattered through every nation. Socrates is not dead because of Plato. Neither is Pythagoras because of the statue of Juno. But the wise king of the new laws he laid down, obviously talking about followers. Now, what we see here, of course, is there are a certain amount of problems that we can see with this. First of all, if it's Jesus, referred to as a wise king. And king is something that Jesus never was in his lifetime. They're always waiting for Jesus to come back to become king. Second, the destruction and the wise king may be somewhat similar, but the amount of time they have is like considerable amount between the two of them. Next one is new laws. We actually know of no actual new laws like that's there. Now, another thing that it brings a point here is, if actually Mara did actually know who Jesus, why didn't he use a name which appears in other sources, either call him Jesus himself or call him Christ, as we see being used in the other sources? Okay, that's what we have. Even if we accept all of this, it still doesn't tell us very much about Jesus that we don't know, or would not have been known for them by that time, because, of course, the Gospels are already out. So we know that Jesus is supposed to be a teacher of information and new things. Now, I think I'm going to wrap up today.
Okay.
We're going to start next week on Josephus, but I just want to look at one more thing, because this is a question that comes up. And they have a fairly decent answer to this, one that may not be happy for some people, but they do have a different answer. Now, the question is, how come there's not more information? Jesus is supposed to be so important. We see certain things in the New Testament which are phenomenal events. One would assume that because of these events, Jesus would be known. Okay?
Right.
We assume that to have been the case. However, first of all, he brings here a few reasons why we shouldn't worry about it. First is that the Roman history works that would have been written at the time actually perished. It's not 100% true, because, of course, Josephus exists, and we'll discuss about him as to why there's a problem with that at all. The second thing is that there was a certain degree of time lag. People didn't write about people in their own lifetime, waited a little bit later on. And because of that, it's possible that this happened, that it wouldn't be allowed. Number 3, which I think he's bringing is some very important thing. The historians are Romans, and they didn't really consider Christianity of any importance until it began to have somewhat effect on Rome itself. If we notice, Suetonius writes only about Claudius, an event where it has historical importance because Claudius dwelt with the Jews. And we believe that Celsus was Jesus, or Tacitus and Nero. And Suetonius talk about what Nero did during the time of the fire, that he blamed the Christians. So they're brought in there, but in general it seems to be ignored. Even if you read Pliny is like, they're not so overly interested in the Christians. They don't really appear on their map until something happens that makes them very important. So that's another reason why you wouldn't have it. A fourth reason, which is also very important, and I think it also makes sense, is the Romans really had no interest. Who cared about another superstition? They didn't write about the Jewish history also, although they actually accepted Judaism more than the Christianity. So they didn't write about it. So because of that, there's a lot of reasons why Christians would think we would have more, would like there to be more information. It wasn't. But what we see from the reasons is something which many of the Christians might not like, is that the reason why there's not much written about Jesus is because basically Jesus wasn't very important in the world at the time. The claim of Jesus being his history, his birth and everything like that, and everything about him being the most documented thing is obviously not true. We don't have the kind of documentation. You can look up events like the Battle of Actium, extremely important in the dating situation. Josephus and other sources actually bring that date because of the importance of world events. The death of Julius Caesar, we know when it was, the 15th of March, and the actual year I don't remember at the moment. It's not really important. If you want, you can look it up. But that is documented from many other different sources, contemporary and otherwise. I mean, to say that Jesus' life is the most documented thing is just blatantly false. To say that there's no information about Jesus, I would say that it's true to say we have no real first-hand information. We talked about the Gospels, how they were not first-hand information. We have no information from outside of Christianity at all that we can say is from people who have direct knowledge of Jesus himself. That there's none any. We do have people who have direct knowledge of Christians. Pliny himself made it his business to find out. He tortured 2 slaves to find out about that. So we see that there's information, but the information is second and third-hand information. We don't have any general information with that. So from our non-Jewish sources, the non-Jewish sources, non-Christian sources, we basically have no significant information. All we can say is basically something which I accept from the outright, that Jesus existed, he died, he was most likely crucified under Pilate for being thought to be Messiah. That's about it. But that doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't tell us whether he did miracles, whether he really did miracles, or anything like that.
Right. Wow.
So that is the sum total of all the information on that subject.
Very cool. Very cool.
Now, next week, what I want to do is, I'm going to ask you to see if there's any questions, whatever, which I'd like to see.
Actually, we've actually run over tonight, so I might have time for them.
Okay.
So it's okay though.
Okay.
But yeah, so next week will be good for sure. Now I didn't get a chance to. I didn't hear you call out the stuff you emailed me tonight. I wasn't sure if you were quoting from it, and I was.
That's for Josephus. Okay. I wasn't sure if I was going to get to it, but I figured I'd get it to you. So we're going to do Josephus. What I sent you out is different versions of the passage in Josephus, the main one.
Perfect.
And different types of reconstructions of it based on the skepticism that exists on scholars, including Christian scholars, by the way.
Excellent. That's certainly going to be interesting for sure. So you guys don't forget to tune in next week, same time, same place as Shem willing. And
let me just say one more thing.
Sure.
If there are questions that you want me to address, I'll look at the YouTube thing, and I'll probably take some of those questions and answer here. My time has become very, I've gotten involved in so many projects that now I don't have as much time to look at the YouTube as I did before. But what I will try and do is I will try and look at the YouTube, and any questions that are asked that are important that I should answer, I'll actually try and answer it next week also.
And you can also go to judaismsanswered.com, and you can reach out. If you want to go directly, you can actually just do the contact us from that source, and you can send them a straight email from there.
Yeah, you can get me an email there also. So there's multiple ways of doing it, but basically I'll do it, and if I feel that I have to, some very good questions, I'll answer it. If the questions take it too much, I'll put Josephus himself another week.
Perfect. That sounds good. All right, Rabbi. Well, thank you, and thank everybody else for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon. Shalom.